Hey guys, for today's lecture, I want to focus a little bit on different types of war and aggression from the political perspective. So, we have a concept in political anthropology of channeled aggression, the idea that societies actually have ways to avoid violence. And I want to bring these up first because these are important before we actually get to the concept of war and militarized conflict between states, to recognize that there are kind of like pressure valves that are put into place to help states avoid breaking into war. And these are at all sorts of levels, right? So these can be at the local level, the tribal level, all the way to the state level. If we're talking about it at the nation state level, let's talk about the Olympics, right? The Olympics are the nation state country level of channeled aggression. So rather than battling it out with actual tanks and guns, we battle it out through sport. The 1980 Miracle on Ice between the US and the USSR is a great example of it. This is part of the reason that countries get so engaged and involved in the Olympics, because ultimately it's a way of expressing national pride, but it's also a way of channeling conflict between states. We see conflicts between tribes and bands, and please check out the other lecture to be sure you are confident with your definitions of both tribes and bands. But tribes and bands, their conflicts usually have to relate to resources or honor. So that can be you've stolen land, you've stolen water, you've stolen people, you've stolen property. This can also include you've dishonored our people, you've dishonored our family, you've stolen our women, besmirched our tribal name. And so fights can include everything from blood vengeance, blood feuds, blood price. And if you think this is not like a modern thing, I had a friend who worked for the United Nations, and literally his job was negotiating blood vengeance and blood feud issues in Lebanon and throughout the Middle East. So that was his whole job. So if you think that this is something like, oh, tribes, like this is old, like 200 years ago. Nope, we're talking about modern conflicts in the modern world today. But when we're talking about warfare, we're talking about it at the next level. And warfare can be between states, it can be between groups of people, subcultures, or sub-military forces against the state, etc. But warfare broadly is just armed hostility and aggression between two groups. The vast majority of states have professional armies. These are full-time militaries, which means the people that are in them are professionals. Their job is to be in the military. And states also belong to larger supranational peacekeeping organizations. The United Nations is the most obvious of them. We also now have the concept of civilians. Civilians are non-combatants. So combatants are people actually engaged in conflict, but civilians are everybody else. Women and children, the elderly, they're civilians, obviously, but really anybody who's not actually a part of the military is a civilian. We also have the concept of universal human rights as a way of dealing with conflicts between states. And these are internationally agreed upon rules that say, look, these are rights that are granted by the human existence, not by a state, not by God. It's just like whatever you believe is the authority that gives human beings rights just by existing. These are what they are. They're pretty limited, what we've actually agreed are universal human rights, and they still get broken all the time, but at least it's an effort to demonstrate that there are overarching standards beyond just the nation state that say that people have rights, and here's what those rights are. Now, total war is when it is all-encompassing, and so we're not just talking about our troops fighting, but we're actually talking about people that are involved in the conflict at home. And so that can be everything from the war is spilling over and your homeland, your city is being bombed, like if you live in the Middle East, like the British did during World War II. You know, they had to experience total war because they were being bombed in London. But total war can also include, hey, our soldiers are off fighting on the front, but we are rationing our food or we're rationing our metals. So this happened a lot during World War II for Americans, right? We weren't actually being bombed, except for when Pearl Harbor happened. But what was happening is we were engaged in a total war because we had rations on rubber and rations on steel, and people were doing gardens to try to grow their own food because there were certain food shortages. This is much more the case in Great Britain. But total war can even mean non-combatants at home participating in the war effort in some way. Or warfare that is important at the state level is asymmetrical warfare. So if a war in the traditional nation state system is based on the idea of one state declaring war on another state, asymmetrical warfare is when subnational or transnational organizations fight with nation states and try to get them to respond to their actions This can include terrorist organizations like the IRA, the PLO, the Tamil Tigers, ISIS, etc. In America, we call this the war on terror, the idea that there are terrorist organizations out there that are trying to attack nation states. So organizations like Al Qaeda trying to attack the United States. This is defined as asymmetrical warfare. There's also the idea of like white supremacy terrorism or other kind of nationalism-based terrorisms. But asymmetrical warfare is about fighting between subnational or transnational organizations and entire nation states. Another term which is important to understand when talking about warfare and the state is terrorism. Now, I'm not going to give you one clear definition for terrorism because there isn't one clear definition of terrorism. It's one of the most hotly contested topics in political theory, sociology, anthropology, political anthropology, etc. Like, who is a terrorist and what constitutes terrorism it depends on who you ask, right? So I have a definition that we're going to use for this course, right? An incident of violent coercion outside of declared war where the goal or the motivation is fear in order to cause political action. In other words, not just random killing, but actually doing violence in order to influence a population and try to achieve some kind of political or social goal. Another form of political violence that's worth being aware of are assassinations, which are the deliberate killing of a political figure. Not an accidental death, not a death from illness or something like that, but the deliberate killing and murder of a political figure, usually for some kind of political cause. And obviously, this can be incredibly traumatic if there's video or some other kind of footage. But surviving an assassination attempt on television or on the radio can actually be like a huge boom for a politician. Another term related to warfare that I want to be clear on is genocide. And I am really, really picky about this term because people use it way too casually these days, right? Because genocide is a real fucking thing and we should take it really fucking seriously. And so when we are talking about a genocide, we should use the term. And then when we're not talking about a genocide, we should not use the term. And so genocide is systemic, planned killing of populations based on some characteristic. It can be race, it can be religion, it can be ethnicity, it can be political beliefs, it can be status, right? But it's systematic and it's planned. So we have numerous cases of this for the past several hundred years. The United States perpetrated a genocide against Native Americans in order to take their land. That's a pretty commonly accepted one here over in the US. We have several examples that have occurred in the last century, including the Holocaust, the Balkan conflict, Rwanda, Sudan. However, we definitely know that at this point, China is genociding its Uyghur Muslims out in the western parts of its country. Myanmar is genociding its Muslims in its countryside. So there are absolutely genocides that are occurring in the world right now. We should definitely learn more about. If you are interested in genocide, this is a topic I know a lot about. Feel free to text me or message me. I would love to talk about it more. It's something that's really important and really interesting. And we have to study these kind of horrible things because that's the only way we can prevent them from happening again, which is obviously the goal, to prevent genocide. There's also something interesting called an autogenocide, which is a genocide, systemic planned killing of large sections of a population. But an autogenocide is when you do it to your own people for a political ideology and for social planning. Probably the best example from the 20th century is Cambodia. I was very, very lucky to go to Cambodia a few years ago and was able to visit the killing fields and Tol Sleng, which was one of the death camps there. And it was just an eye-opening experience, and it's horrifying and terrifying. If you are interested, feel free to ask me. I would love to talk about it and direct you to resources. The auto-genocide in Cambodia is an example. Within 4 years, it only took place over 4 years, right? The dictator Pol Pot killed 2.5 million people, or a quarter of their entire population. One out of every 4 Cambodians was killed by their own dictatorial leader. And I mean, it's horrifying to learn about. The country has been rebuilding ever since. Cambodia is an incredibly welcoming country. I highly recommend it. It's very safe now, and it's a great place to go backpacking. So make sure that you feel free to go there and learn about it. But when you go to Cambodia, people want to talk about this because it's only a generation ago. And so this is still really in people's minds. And it's amazing to realize that you can have a government that actually goes through and exterminates members of their own population. It's really something that a lot of countries should be concerned about as we move further and further towards authoritarian regimes and conservatism and dictatorial politics in several countries around the world. Okay, guys, thank you very much for listening. I greatly enjoyed our lecture today. Make sure you keep up with the reading and keep checking out the lectures. Thanks for listening.